Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Michael Simmons, the Spectator's data editor. This week, the MP David Davis chaired a panel of international medical experts who found that not a single one of the babies that Lucy Letby has been convicted of murdering died, by her hand. They found that either it was some other medical condition or there was some kind of medical negligence by the hospital or someone else. David Davis joins me now, along with writer Christopher Snowdon. David, why did you get involved with the case?
Well, in the first instance, I took a similar view, I think, to the one Christopher takes, which is, this woman was a monster who'd killed all these children and tried to kill others, so took no view on it. Then, just by sheer accident, I was waiting on a call from Mike Lynch. Remember Mike Lynch, the guy who died in the yacht? He had just won his court case in California, and I was waiting for a call from him just to talk about that. And I got this call from America. I thought it was him, and it turned out to be just somebody I know in New York who was suggesting I look at the New Yorker piece about the Letby trial. When I tried to get at it, it was blocked. There was a court order blocking it. And I eventually got it another way, but I thought, well, why the hell is it being blocked? So I raised it in justice questions the next day. And I would have thought no more about it. It got batted away, but I made the point. And then in the next week or so, in fact, in the next 2 weeks, to give you the sort of complete days, I got contacted by 16 different people, all of whom you would judge to be more authoritative experts than the people actually took part in the trial. They range from past president of the Royal Statistical Society and a whole load of stats professors, some forensic medico-legal people, a number of neonatologists, a couple of nurses, one of whom had worked there, and so on. These were not your normal sort of mob of conspiracy theorists, which we've all got used to these days after a particular thing. And so I thought, well, I had to pay attention to this. And so I had a look and very, very quickly came to the view that it had been, for a variety of reasons, particularly the expert evidence that was accepted, so-called expert evidence, that it was a mistrial at least. But I was not at that stage. Now we're talking May, June. I was not at that stage persuaded that it was a miscarriage, because it's possible to get the right answer by accident, and that happens in British courts more often than we like to admit, I suspect. So I then spent the next few months trying to find what you might think of as a sort of I described it as a slam dunk, but basically a very clear piece of evidence that indicated that Letby had killed one child. I didn't need to find seven, and also talk to the experts I talked about. And broadly speaking, they were of the view that there hadn't been a murder, let alone that Letby was responsible. There actually hadn't been a murder, that these spikes were not that uncommon. In fact, in the year before, the year after, and the year in which the Council of Chester had this spike, there were 3 other hospitals had similar size spikes, measured in terms of deaths per 1,000 children. So I came to the view that this was likely to be a real miscarriage, and the reason I went through all that time is because I knew that once I actually engaged on this properly, it would become very time consuming, quite high stress. There'd be a fair amount of quite venomous responses online. I expected that. But for somebody to be put in prison for their entire life if it's wrong, I'm afraid it's worth doing it.
Chris, you're fairly staunchly of the opposite view that Letby is guilty and that the jury and the appeal courts have already made the correct decision. David mentioned some of the statistical evidence that's got a lot of attention earlier on, and now obviously this supposedly new medical evidence. Why do you think David and his experts are wrong?
There's a presumption of guilt, obviously, because she's serving 15 whole life sentences in prison for murdering and torturing babies. So, that would be a reasonable place for most people to start. I actually kind of came at this in a different way to David. I started off not knowing very much about it. I didn't really follow the case very much at the time, but I did. When I initially read about it, thought there was a chance this woman may be guilty, because it didn't seem a lot of what you might call strong, hard evidence against her. But I found that the more I read about the case, the more convinced of her guilt I became. The statistics has always been a huge red herring. It's really got nothing to do with statistics. It never has had anything to do with statistics. There was obviously a correlation between Letby being in the hospital every time a baby collapsed unexpectedly and or died, and the doctors noticed that, but that wasn't the reason she was convicted. It was the reason there was an investigation, and that investigation was very thorough, and several years later led to her being tried and convicted. But the statistics has got nothing to do with it. I've always said the thing that would make me change my mind about this is if you could get a very large group of scientists, relevant scientists, to say that, Dowie Evans, the lead prosecution witness, doesn't know what he's talking about, nor do the other neonatologists, nor do the radiologist and the hematologist and all the other experts that came. And if it could be shown, this isn't how air embolism works, and actually there's an obvious way, obvious reason why these children died, that probably would be enough for the Court of Appeal. I mean, really, what they want to see is new evidence that exonerates her, rather than just a difference of opinion. But if that difference of opinion was very, very widely held across a huge number of medical organizations, if the Royal College of Physicians and the BMA, for example, came out and said, look, we've looked at this and this is complete nonsense, then because the medical evidence is such a key part of the case, not by any means the only part, but a very important part, then you obviously have to look at it again. I just don't think that's what's been achieved with this new panel. I don't think it has any chance, actually, of succeeding in the Court of Appeal. It's got half a chance of succeeding in getting the Criminal Cases Review Commission to push it to the Court of Appeal, but only because it might put some pressure on it, and particularly after the Andrew Malkinson case, which was a disgrace for the CCRC. They may feel that it will err on the side of caution, push it towards the Court of Appeal. But I really don't see how the Court of Appeal is going to have any time for it, because so much of it, and I don't think the people who produce this report realise this, but so much of what they're saying has already been tested in court. And the Court of Appeal is very intolerant of people repackaging up previous evidence and arguments and saying, we want you to have a look at this again. There's not enough new stuff in this report, and what is new is pretty conjectural, and some of it, as far as I can see, is plain wrong.
Well, let me just pick up a few points there, can I? Number one, the assertion that she was there for all of the deaths. Well, actually, there were 17 deaths. That's 15 more than usual.
That's not correct.
She wasn't even there for the majority of them.
There were 13 deaths, and she was there for 12.
Yes, it is. Let me, Christopher, I didn't interrupt you. I read your spiked article. It was amusing. About a dozen errors of logic and fact in it, but never mind. But let me just deal with that. I mean, she was said to be there for 6. She was said originally for 7. 1 they got wrong. They're still not sure, because the data they used, the access data, turned out to be exits rather than entrances. But by the by, let's accept 6. That means quite a lot she was not there for. Secondly, nobody, literally nobody, saw her do anything that amounted to the acts of murder that have been described. Thirdly, the person who presented the case in the press conference the other day is the man that Dowie Evans whose work he's based on, namely that the one who wrote the original paper on air embolism. Unfortunately, Mr. Evans misread it. He misread the signals, the so-called Lee sign. He also misread it because it was about arterial air embolism, not about venous air embolism. And there are so many, there are a whole load of errors of this nature. One of the problems that strikes me as well, and I talked about this in Parliament, was that the accusers here, and by the way, they didn't check when they were on duty, the accusers here are people who are actually party to some of the mistakes. I don't say that these are even unusual mistakes, but they're party to the mistakes that led to the deaths of these children. And one of the difficulties we have here, apart from the failure of the expert system, I do not think Dowie Evans was a very plausible expert in this context, and the point of the 14 people we brought to bear a couple of days ago, they are more expert in most of the things that we were talking about. But so they've got a problem with the way we deal with expert witnesses. Dr. Evans, or Mr. Evans, I'm not sure what he is at the moment with his license, was working for the police, paid by the police, technically has a duty to the court, but I'm not sure that he pursued that very well. So you've got that problem. Secondly, you're quite right. The Court of Appeal is very loath to look at what it terms not evidence that's not new, even if the individual concerned, and let's leave this case aside, even if the individual concerned didn't deploy the evidence, made a mistake, their lawyers made a mistake, you can get condemned to life in prison if your lawyers make a mistake. They could be good lawyers and still make a tactical mistake. I don't think that's justice, frankly. So there are two errors there, but the one that, over and above the miscarriage, the one that worries me most is that you've got a hospital which has actually been responsible for the deaths of a disproportionate number of children. And I think bluntly recognizes itself it wasn't up to doing the job, because it downgraded its own rating the day it suspended Miss Letby from its job, from her job. So, it hasn't touched a baby like most of these ones who died since those days, because it's not good enough. It doesn't have the skills, the resources, the number of properly qualified nurses, the number of highly qualified doctors that are necessary. One of the criticisms of it by the Royal College, and again, something that wasn't shown to the court at the time, one of the criticisms of it by the Royal College was that it only had once a week consultant rounds rather than one a day. Another criticism, not with the Royal College, but one that was leaked, was there was a Pseudomonas infection, which we don't know about. We don't know whether that had an effect or not, because we don't have the diagnostic data, but it's entirely possible. Dr. Lee said a couple of days ago in the press conference that there was another infection. It wasn't one I was familiar with, which was largely responsible for the death of one child. So a whole series of errors in this. And let me finally come to your point about the issue of probabilities. Now, the way a typical court runs is it starts with, and forgive me, but I'm boringly familiar with them for other reasons. The way a typical court runs is the prosecution makes its case, makes an opening speech. In this case, it was about 3.5 days from memory. And a large part of that was the table which showed 7 deaths, and the only person on for the 7 deaths was Lucy Letby. Now, that was clearly very persuasive. It was persuasive to the journalists watching. And so I assume, we can't know for sure, I assume it was pretty persuasive with the jury. And once you've established something like that, you do have a tendency to confirmatory bias in everything that follows. And we can talk through some of the rather doubtful bits of evidence if you like. But all of those things seem to me to be reasons to retry this, not to assume she's innocent, although I think she is. I think it's far, massively more probable, 100 times more probable. This was a failure of the system, not a failure, not a malice on her part. But it should be retried. That's what's needed here. Frankly, I would always hold whole life sentences open to appeal anyway, just in the same way in the States. Pretty much, it's almost automatic you get an appeal if you've got a death sentence. The most serious sentences should be open to it. But that's why I want to see it retried.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
And Chris, just before you come back on David's points, do you not accept that even if you're still pretty certain she's guilty, that there seems to be so much called into question about the case now that whether she's guilty or not, let's just do the trial again?
No. I mean, you can't have a retrial, especially one that lasted 10 months. You can't retry that just because some people think that there's something odd about the result, or they frankly don't understand what the case was about. in the first place. It was a vast case made up a huge amount of all sorts of different pieces of evidence that I don't claim to have a full grasp on at all, but I still know a lot more than the vast majority of people have been talking about this. There needs to be some solid, preferably new evidence that exonerates this woman from at least one of the charges, and obviously she needs to get off all 15. And it's not going to happen with the kind of talk that we've been hearing on this, and indeed on Tuesday in the press conference. You know, why are these things happening in the press conferences anyway? Why don't they quietly put their evidence to the CCRC? I don't think Letby's lawyer even thinks this has much of a chance, quite frankly. I think the whole thing is about publicity and perhaps trying to change public opinion in advance of fresh charges, which he may well very soon be facing under Operation Hummingbird. Can I come back on some of what David has said? It doesn't really matter because it wasn't based on statistics. It was about the suspicious deaths rather than the total number of deaths. But as it happens, of the 13 deaths over this period, Letby was there on 12 occasions. And this doesn't depend on door swipe data. None of it did. There was no doubt Letby did not deny being cotside or in the wards with these babies when they died, and there were obviously eyewitness testimonies too. If I may, I don't want to get bogged down in too much detail because a lot of people watching won't understand it, but just to give you an example of what I mean, take the case of baby D, who, by the way, was not premature and would still be admitted to the hospital even after it's been downgraded. She wasn't premature, but she was born with pneumonia, and she was being treated for pneumonia, and then she started having the sudden kind of collapses and recoveries. It was very common. It's weirdly common amongst many of Letby's victims. And on the final time she collapsed, she sadly died. And because she had pneumonia at the time, pneumonia was put down on the death certificate. This was then challenged by Dowie Evans and the other people who looked at the medical records. The whole theory was tested in court. Shuley's panel have come back, effectively doing a post-mortem without seeing the baby or speaking to any of the staff, and said pneumonia. Now, even if you think it was pneumonia, this has got no legs to stand on legally, because that question has already been asked and answered during the original trial. It's not going to be just relitigated just because some people think in a position largely of ignorance that there was something wrong with it. I'll give you one more example that is even more relevant. People seem to have forgotten. Only 2 months ago, less than 2 months ago, there was another press conference by Mark MacDonald in which Richard Taylor, another eminent neonatologist, stood up and he gave his theories as to how baby O died. He said that baby O died because a doctor had put a needle in the wrong side of his body, and he died of shock. He also then said that baby F, who had been poisoned with insulin, had not actually been poisoned with insulin. The tests were just wrong. And this went down very well with all the pro-Letby people, and they would say, oh, we must have a retrial, she's innocent, so on and so forth. Now, less than 2 months later, we have Dr. Shuley and his report saying that, no, this is, firstly, obviously not air embolism. I don't think any of them are air embolism, but he doesn't think it's the injection either. Apparently, at least a third explanation is baby O had liver trauma from a traumatic birth, a traumatic delivery. He was born with a planned cesarean section. I know no evidence that there was any injury sustained, but that's their hypothesis, even though it's completely different to the hypothesis of MacDonald's previous expert, who now seems to have been written out of history, wasn't mentioned, nor are the two neonatologists that wrote the report. And the baby F, the insulin poisoning now the tests are right, but the readings were perfectly normal for a newborn. This is all over the place. The idea that this is going to succeed in court, I think, is ridiculous based on what we've seen so far.
Let's deal with baby O, shall we? Baby O had a bleed essentially into the liver sac. What include the sac, the organic sac that contains the liver, and right enough, as Taylor said, and if you ask Shuley, if you've been at the conference, you'd ask Shuley this, he would have confirmed it, that the doctor on duty, thinking that that there was too much air in the abdomen, splinting as they call it, put a needle in to the wrong side. You put it into the wrong side of the baby, and it went into the liver. All of that's in the notes. It's not a question of hypothesis. It's not guess. You know, there have been thousands of pages of these notes that they've read, you haven't. And the simple truth is that that baby, again, in the notes, had a 50% reduction in its hemoglobin levels. What if you had that or I had that, we'd be in shock. I'm not quite sure what it does to a neonate, but we'd be in shock. So there's little doubt that it's got nothing to do with air embolism. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And again, what these doctors did, and these are very, very highly qualified doctors, far more qualified than Dr. Evans, I'm afraid. Each of them went through in pairs, separately through each of these cases, all 17, in fact. Yeah, each of these cases. And if they came to the same conclusion, then you saw the summary. If they didn't, they'd have a third expert on whatever the difference was, come and look at it and help them arbitrate. This is not guesswork. This is going through the documentation around every child in a way which, and I've now been through the transcript as well as the daily accounts, does not appear to have happened in court. You've had assertions in court, but not detailed everything.
Of course he did. How did he get on for 10 months?
And I'm afraid
it's through an enormous amount of evidence.
They sat through 10 months and lots of commentary. But I don't think
I've been listening to a lot of transcripts.
Frankly,
a lot of them are available.
I recommend you go get yourself a copy of the transcript.
And if you read the transcript of, even if you just read the prosecution summing up, you can see that they discussed this theory about the injection in the liver. It was tested, evidence was given against it, and it was rejected. But that still doesn't address my point, which is not only has this stuff already been tested in court and therefore has no legs to stand on appeal, it's that even in the space of 2 months, the story has changed on this one baby. In fact, on two babies. Well, now it's birth trauma, not injection.
I don't agree with it. That isn't a change of the story. The key measure
no
here
one disputes
is the drop in the hemoglobin
died
level.
The result of injury to the liver.
That's far more dangerous.
It's how the injury came back.
Well, yes, they do. Yes, they do. Yes, they do dispute that. You say they don't dispute it? Well, she wasn't accused of murdering him by bleeding them to death or by causing a shock in the liver. She was accused of air embolism. So there is a complete difference of outcome. So there is a dispute there. You can't just walk around the evidence, I'm afraid. Which is what you did in your Spike article, what you're doing today. And I think the truth of the matter is, when the CCRC sees it, we'll see the outcome. And if it goes back to appeal, we'll see real experts deliver their views on this off the real facts, not off a theory which was designed around the police's...
Oh, this sounds rather conspiratorial now.
The police's requirements for a prosecution case. We'll also see, while we're at it, we will also see, I think, a fairly thorough view of how the police addressed this and how they attacked this case, and including, for example, the fact that they hired a statistician to advise them on how they were putting together these accounts of when they were on and when they were off, or when various nurses were on and off, and how they and the fact they were advised by that statistical professor, very eminent professor in statistics, that they were doing.
I've heard her talk about this case.
They were doing it the wrong way. No, some of them weren't, I'm afraid. They were doing it the wrong way. They're doing it the wrong way, and what happened? The prosecution lawyer said, "Drop that statistician."
David Spiegelhalter, who is genuinely an eminent statistician, gave evidence to the Thorwall inquiry and showed how pointless it would have been to bring statistics into this case whatsoever.
I recommend your viewers read the evidence from Spiegelhalter. It doesn't help your case very much.
Gentlemen, we've run out of time, so we'll, as you say, we'll leave the readers to look at the evidence on their own time. Thank you, David, and thank you, Chris.